Thank you for tuning in to another episode of InRange. On the table in front of me today, you see an 1861 Springfield musket, and you see an 1853 Enfield rifled musket. But we're not actually here to talk so much about the rifled muskets themselves today. What I'm here to talk about today are the standard projectiles, the bullets, used by the Union forces during the U.S. Civil War. The Confederacy had a somewhat different approach to this issue, and we'll talk about that in a separate video. However, everyone thinks today that, of course, the Minie Ball, or Minie Ball, as you frequently hear in the U.S., is what we used during the U.S. Civil War. And the simple projectile, this simple concept of a smaller bore-sized projectile that was seated but was able to engage the rifling of a rifled musket, allowed these weapons to engage a man with aimed fire out to 600 yards. And this was an incredible difference on the battlefield that did not exist before that. And as a result, the bloodshed of the U.S. Civil War was tremendous, to say the least. However, the Minie Ball, or the Minie Ball here in the U.S., really isn't even a Minie Ball. It is the improved Minie Ball as designed by Captain Burton of Harper's Ferry. The Minie Ball was developed in 1830s France, and it was a projectile that was smaller than the bore diameter of the weapon it was to be fired in, had a cavity in it, but it had an iron plug in it, and that iron plug was used as a piston of sorts upon the expansion of the gases of the black powder to force itself up into the cavity of the projectile, cause it to expand, engage the rifling, and move down the bore. This, of course, allowed you to seat an undersized projectile down a black powder bore, even one that's fouled, without any form of cloth patching or something else like that. And of course, rifled muskets versus smoothbore muskets changed accuracy dramatically. However, Captain Burton looked at this design and realized that this could be simplified. And simplifying the cost and manufacture of projectiles for a standing armory is something that's always people want to do. So what he did is he removed the iron plug, expanded or it made the cavity of the projectile deeper, and made the tail much thinner. As a result, you didn't need the iron plug for the tail to expand and engage the rifling, and this made this a single-piece projectile of just lead without having to manufacture a separate secondary piece of an iron plug. It's also interesting to note that the projectiles of that time were typically not cast like we do today. Typically, you'll take melted lead, pour it into a mold, open it up, and that gives you your projectile. In modern days, that has a flat nose because you have to cut it off with a sprue. Back then, lead was put into a compression die and under force was forced into the shape of the projectile. This allowed you to do one step of crushing the lead into the shape it needed to be and having a uniform, consistent diameter of the bullet every time. And as a result, original Civil War Minie bullets, or now what we're going to call improved Miniés, the Burton bullets, have a round nose versus a flat nose. Just an interesting side note. But since the 1861 Springfield was the standard arm of the Union Army, and that 1861 Springfield is a .580 bore diameter rifled musket, the initial manufacture of the Burton Ball, as the Army standardized on, was .576 in diameter, leaving a 4/1000th clearance gap between the projectile and the sidewalls of the bore diameter upon seating upon the powder charge. But when the U.S. Civil War started to really ramp up, the reality is that the federal forces were quite small, and they had a very small number of 1861 muskets at their disposal. They had to go afield and buy arms from the open market, and they did. Both the Union and Confederacy pretty much standardized on what was then the 1853 rifled musket from England, many of them being surplus weapons from the Crimean War. Some of them were manufactured intentionally for the purpose, but many of the rifled muskets that came in from England, both for the Union and Confederacy, were surplus arms from their battles. So, here's what's interesting. The 1861 Springfield musket is .58. The 1853 rifled musket is .577. This means that the improved Minie Burton balls at .576 have only a 1/1000th clearance to seat down the bore diameter of a .577 Enfield. And when you have mass numbers of these in the field, you can seat a couple bullets before the fouling prevents it to be possible, but with only 1,000 clearing, very quickly the 7.7 bore becomes unusable. So what they did is they simply reduced the diameter of the projectile so that the same projectile would work in the 1861 Springfield and the 1853 rifled Enfield musket. They turned the diameter down from .576 to .574. So let's take a closer look at how these projectiles actually work. This is the Burton .574 improved Minié. So you have the nose of the bullet, you have lube grooves here, which are beeswax and tallow. But to make this work, they have to make a very deep cavity and a very thin lead tail. So what happens is, as the gases from the black powder fill this cavity, it eventually expands this tail, and this bullet expands right here up until the tip of the cavity, and this is what engages the rifling in the rifled musket and stabilizes the projectile. But it does take a little while for this process to occur. Here is a Type 2 Williams bullet. All the benefits of a improved Minié or Burton Ball. It has the lube grooves with the beeswax and tallow, but it doesn't have a cavity. It has a piston. This piston is made of a different metal. This is made of something harder than the soft lead. And as the gases from the expanding black powder push this piston forward, it actually causes the bullet to expand here first, and this is what engages the rifling. This happens essentially immediately upon detonation, sealing the bore. But as the piston continues to apply pressure and the gas continues to apply pressure to the piston, this bullet actually expands all the way down to its rear, to its tail, and that provides even more surface engagement for the rifling. And it's the reason that Hiram Burton stated that this was the best bullet for military applications, not only in that it would expand quickly and provide a quote-unquote cleaner bore, which is how it got the moniker a cleaner bullet. Also, because of the better surface area of engagement with the rifling, this was actually a more accurate projectile. So here we have an 1861 Springfield musket, and we have a Burton .574 projectile here, and a Williams Type 2, which comes in at .570. Of course, the bore on a 61 musket is .58. So that gives you a little bit of the idea of the clearance you have with a Burton ball versus a Williams ball. These are both seated in front of 60 or 65 grains of FFG black powder. So let's go through both things and why the Type 2 Williams ball was known to be the cleaner bullet, even though it wasn't designed to be a bullet used to clean the bore. When you fire the gun, hitting a musket cap here on the cone, a spark goes down into the charge, which is the black powder charge here. Black powder does tend to detonate very fast, but it still burns in a curve. And so what happens is the Burton ball will start moving down the bore before all of the black powder charge has been burnt, and as a result, it also takes a while for the tail of the Burton ball to flare sufficiently to completely seal the bore. So as the Burton ball moves down here, it is not sealed yet, not sealed yet, not sealed yet, and let's say here, about 4 or 5 inches down the barrel, this is when the tail of the Burton ball actually seals and completely prevents any more gas from leaking by the projectile during the duration of its time going down the bore. That means that from here to here, that the gases from the black powder are not only causing the tail of the ball to expand, they're also going past the ball and increasing the fouling from around here to around here in the barrel. And that fouling over each subsequent shot will get harder and thicker, meaning that the .58 diameter of this barrel will decrease in terms of overall dimension. And each time you go to seat a Burton ball, which is sized to .574, eventually the fouling will exceed that gap or that clearance, and you're going to have a problem seating the ball, and you're going to land up hearing stories about guys using like a rock or a tree to be able to seat the Burton ball all the way on the powder charge. It's also very important with black powder to seat the projectile and compress the black powder charge, because black powder that is not compressed actually is more of an explosive than a propellant, and that causes a dangerous situation. So the reason the Williams Type 2 bullet doesn't have that problem is pretty simple. The minute this powder charge starts to detonate, piston shoves directly up into the Type 2 Williams bullet, and the bullet expands right about here immediately, meaning that instead of the ball sealing the bore down here and allowing gas to blow by during that entire duration of travel, the ball actually seals right here, meaning that from here and all the way down the rest of the barrel is essentially clean, because gases and black powder fouling did not escape around the projectile during flight. Williams Type 2 bullet, and Type 1 for that matter, as well as the Type 3, expanded immediately upon ignition of the black powder charge and prevented black powder fouling from escaping around the projectile, and thus this area from here to here stayed just as clean as the rest of the barrel, meaning that you could fire many subsequent Type 2 or Type 1 or Type 3 Williams bullets more than you could a Burton ball, which eventually would be problematic due to the fouling that was now here in the bore just down from the chamber. Okay, so now we have a problem. We have a bullet that works in both guns, and these are the standard weapons of the Union force, And there are a lot of people on the market are trying to come up with their ideas that'll fix the problem. One such person was Elijah Williams, who came up with the improved bullet Type 1 in 1861. And that 1861 improved bullet made a big difference. In fact, it went back to the original concepts of the original 1830s French Minié by adding a piston. Now, different than an iron or lead plug, but it still was a piston with a zinc washer. And he went to government and said, hey, I've got this better design. And the Type 1 was a little different than the Type 2. The Type 2 looks very much like a regular Minie Ball. But the reality is they looked at it and realized this was a much better design because this solved the problem whether you had an 1861 Springfield or an 1853 Enfield. And they started to adopt it. The Type 2 went into mass production and slowly but surely was going to replace the improved Minié or the Burton Ball. Soldiers started getting their reload packets, and there'd be a couple of these improved Williams bullets in their pack. And then over time, it got to be where there was 6 out of 10 of the provided cartridges to the Union soldier were these improved bullets. And in all theory, they should have worked better, but in reality, a lot of people didn't like them. The standard soldier frequently had to go on what's called picket duty or guard duty of camp. When you were at camp and were in an open battlefield, the reality is you were the only one that had loaded weapons. The rifled muskets that were in camp were cleaned and unloaded. So when you were on picket duty, you loaded your rifled musket so that you had a loaded weapon, and if you had to fire it, it was typically considered a signal charge or a signal to everyone in the camp to get ready, something's going on. So you'd load this thing with your standard Burton Ball, and of course, as I said earlier, you've got a .574 Burton Ball and a .58 diameter rifled musket. And reality is, most picket duty, guess what? Nothing ever happens, you never fired the gun. So when you went back to camp and you were off of your required picket duty, you would stick a worm on a ramrod down your bore, turn it, pull the projectile out of your clean bore. It would come out quite easily because the tail hadn't expanded, and dump the powder out, briefly clean out the musket, and you were good to go. So that was the way you would unload a rifled musket in the time. You had to unload it from the front, just like you loaded it. Well, frequently, soldiers would accidentally smash either a Type 1 or Type 2 Williams improved bullet with a lot of vigor as they seated it, which they were really and totally instructed to do. And that would actually push the piston up into the projectile and expand it before they ever fired the gun. This meant that when you stuck your ramrod down with your worm to pull that projectile out, it wasn't coming out. You couldn't unload it. So when you're on picket duty, these requirements of unloading your rifled musket upon returning to camp became a real problem. And soldiers started, probably, this is conjecture, we don't know for a fact, but we're pretty sure that a lot of soldiers saw that. And the improved bullets, by the way, came in a green cartridge package instead of a white or brown cartridge package. They started discarding them. Because guess what? I don't want to load that in my gun because I can't unload it when I'm off picket duty. This started creating a legend and lore that there was something wrong with the Williams improved bullet. And the reality is that Elijah Williams died in 1864. And there were, as I said earlier, the arms and weapon improvement and weird ideas as well as good ideas that were coming to Washington at the time to make this a winnable war and how we can end the war sooner with my technology. A lot of them were projectiles and other things. And upon Williams' death, a lot of these people started using politics and lore to demonize the now what was going to be adopted, officially adopted, Williams improved bullet Type 2. And as a result, the soldiers in the field heard this lore that the Williams bullet would actually damage the gun, which was false. And then on top of that, their picket duty, they had a problem unloading it because, well, that was just the policy of the time. These things started getting disposed of in the field in massive numbers and just thrown away, and archaeological digs seem to prove that out. But as a result of the politics and conspiracies and fake news, really, about the Williams Type 2 and Type 3 bullets, they got pulled out and disposed of, and the large majority of them that weren't just thrown away in the field landed up being used as shrapnel and artillery shells, and we went right back to the old school Burton bullet, which was in all ways and definitions an inferior projectile. However, it's interesting to note that the other lore continued after this. As these bullets started becoming more and more in the pack of the soldier in the field, and the way that they opened up sooner in the back, the lore, and I'm not sure where this started, it became that this was a cleaner bullet. They were provided to you so that after you fired a bunch of Burton balls, you'd use this as a cleaner round. Well, that wasn't what it meant when they said this was a cleaner bullet. They said this was a cleaner bullet because it always fired cleaner, because it never allowed the fouling to occur in the first place. in theory, if you were to shove a Williams improved bullet, type 1, type 2, or 3, down a foul bore and have it expand, it probably would scrape some of the fouling out and would act as a cleaner of your bore. But it really was always meant to just be a cleaner bullet, not a bullet used to clean your bore. And that's something we hear all the time nowadays, that the cleaner bullets were issued to make the rifle still usable again. And the reality is they were going to standardize on the Williams improved bullet, and they were going to get rid of the Burton Ball entirely until legend, lore, and politics made that infeasible. Well, guys, I hope you enjoy this kind of content. It's you, the viewer, that keep InRange alive. I have no advertising money whatsoever. This is an unsponsored channel. We have no corporate overlords, no masters. Strictly you, the viewer, completely sponsored by you via Patreon. And it's you that do that. All of you Patreon supporters that do that already, you're the reason that these rifled muskets are here and we're able to do a series on Civil War weapons and this sort of legend and lore. And I thank you. If you're not already a Patreon supporter, please consider it. If you can't, I understand. Just subscribe to one of my channels. You can find them all on InRange.tv. Thanks for watching.